Hey, it's Lindsay with the Bride Link. And before we get started on all the great wedding advice that we have for you today, I just wanted to let you know that there's a free download that can help you plan out your ceremony. So, everywhere where each person's going to stand and where all of your VIPs are going to sit in the front row is going to be really easy to figure out if you have an organized way to do so. Today's podcast is all about tips for the ceremony. And before you get started, downloading this freebie is really going to help. So you can find the freebie in the link below or on thebridlink.com. Welcome to the Bride Link podcast, your home for expert wedding planning advice. Today we're talking all about how to arrange your ceremony processional, especially for non-traditional families. So families possibly with step parents, maybe a processional that has a same-sex wedding going on, anything outside of the ordinary mom plus dad processional. So, first, let's go over what a traditional ceremony processional includes. Then, we can talk about how to deviate from that just to make it fit whatever your family arrangement is. So, the traditional ceremony processional is the most traditional way to get your family members and your bridal party down the aisle on your big day. First, typically it leads in with the officiant. Officiants are typically walking down the aisle and just standing up at the altar. This signals that the processional or the ceremony is about to begin. Next would be grandparents of the groom, if they're still with us, and they would walk down the aisle first because the groom traditionally walks out before the bride does. Sometimes grandparents may need an escort and they need a little bit of help to walk down the aisle if needed. You can use an usher, a close family member, or you could ask groomsmen to escort grandparents down the aisle and then circle back around to escort a bridesmaid. You can also skip this part if your grandparents have trouble walking and they can go ahead and be seated in the front row. Next, you're going to be going with the grandparents of the bride. You'll notice a trend that everything is grouped. So the groom's grandparents first, then the bride's grandparents, and then so on. So after that is parents of the groom. This would be following all of the grandparents, and it also would be following any other family members that the groom wanted to include that was a VIP or is sitting in the front row. So maybe somebody else that was involved in raising them. They would walk in between the grandparents and the parents. Next would be the mother of the bride. Following the parents of the groom would follow the mother of the bride. She's typically escorted by an usher or another family member. This is also the time for any additional family of the bride that is a VIP to walk down before the mother of the bride. Tradition is the mother of the bride is the last person to walk before the actual wedding party. I have seen some weddings where the father of the bride escorts the mother of the bride, and then after they drop the mother of the bride off at their seat, they circle back and escort the bride down the aisle. Next, after the mother of the bride, is groomsmen or bridesmaids. It's time for the bridal party to walk down the aisle. They can either walk down in pairs or one by one, depending on your preference. You can also choose to have the groomsmen enter from the side, like you would in a traditional church wedding, and what I call a wolf pack, where it's just a big bunch of groomsmen walking in all at once. Sometimes they're led by the groom walking in first, but tradition would show that the groom would be walking in after the groomsmen. Most of the time, the groom will just make a subtle entrance from the side or the back entrance. If the groom does not enjoy walking down the aisle by himself, he has a few options that he could look at. Traditionally, it would be with the best man or the officiant, but also we've had some grooms that have walked the mother of the groom down the aisle and the father of the groom, and I can tell you that their parents absolutely love it. Next would be a flower girl and a ring bearer. After the maid of honor has walked down the aisle and it's the last person in the wedding party, at least the adults of the wedding party, you would have ring bearers and then flower girls. If these kids are young, my suggestion, if they're all under the age of 4, you probably might want to send them in one big grouping together as they're more likely to make it in a group if they're toddlers. Following that would be the bride and the father of the bride. The bride is usually on her dad's left side, ladies on the left, when walking down to the altar. When at the altar, the groomsmen will align themselves on the right side and the bridesmaids will align themselves on the left side. Remember the rule, ladies on the left. The bride will always be on the left and the groom will always be on the right at a traditional ceremony. And then also, when you're thinking about the reception, this is usually how you set them up to sit at their table together. So now let's talk about a same-sex ceremony processional. With same-sex marriages, there's 1,000 different ways where you can set up a processional. And really, let's be honest, whatever works for you is going to work. But here's just one example of what you could do for your processional. First, you could send the officiant down. And then next, you can send down, if there are any parents, the grandparents and parents, just as the same as we would do in the traditional processional that I just mentioned. But if you have groomsmen or bridesmen, so maybe you've got guys standing in as bridesmaids, you can mix and match your wedding party as needed in whatever order makes sense. I've had two girls walk down the aisle together. We've had two guys walk down the aisle together. And if you're uncomfortable with any of that, you can just send them down one by one down the aisle. Whoever you want to stand beside you makes sense. So don't feel like you have to have all girls in matching dresses on one side and all guys in matching tuxedos on the other side. It's more important that the people that you love are up there with you. So mix and match genders and outfits however you need to make sure that everybody you care about is standing up there with you. For the grooms or the brides in a same sex wedding, this is the fun part where you have to try to figure out how you can both make your grand entrance into the ceremony. You can play rock, paper, scissors to try to figure out who goes first and who goes last. Sometimes I've even had couples walk in together as a family, get married, and then walk out as a family as well. Whatever works for you. Now, the only thing I'm going to say, though, is if you have not done a first look, so you're waiting to see each other when you walk down the aisle during the ceremony, you need to be really cognizant about where you are right before you walk down the aisle. I'd hate for you to spend the entire day not seeing each other just so you can run right into each other right before the ceremony starts. So next, we can talk about step parents or divorced parents as part of the processional and a way that you can include them and your biological parents in your wedding day. So first, we're going to send the officiant down the aisle. It's my favorite to send the officiant first because this probably isn't the first wedding they've done. They're probably not nervous. And as a wedding planner, they're going to pay attention to what I say as to where you walk down the aisle specifically. And if they lead the way in the correct way, every other person that walks down the aisle is going to follow suit, and they're going to follow suit correctly. So we send the officiant down the aisle first, just like we would in a traditional processional. Next would be the grandparents of the groom. Now, if you're including step grandparents as well, step grandparents would walk in first, and then the biological grandparents would walk in next. If you remember to send out paternal grandparents first, that's the order it goes in. So what I'm saying, so with the grandparents of the groom, the paternal grandparents would be the groom's father's parents. They walk in first. Step parents would be walking in first of that. And then the groom's mother's parents would walk in next. The same thing when you switch to grandparents of the bride. The bride's father's parents walk in first. So maybe that would be the bride's grandfather escorting the step grandmother down the aisle. And that's from the dad's side. And then the bride's mother's parents walk in next. I hope that's not confusing. When it gets into sticky family situations, it can get confusing. But in all honesty, any way that you do it, it's your wedding and it's going to be okay. Next, after the grandparents, of course, are any other VIPs that might be close to you, but then the parents of the groom. If the groom's parents are divorced or have step parents, they will enter in separately. This will also include any other family members that the groom wants to include as a VIP or in his first row. So, for example, mom and stepdad would enter. Following them, dad and stepmom would enter. Typically for weddings, often we put mom in the best seat in the house. So that's the seat on the aisle side, right in the corner in the front row. And depending on the family dynamics, you might want to have stepdad sit beside mom, stepmom sit beside stepdad, and then dad sit in the fourth seat over. That's what I do when parents don't get along. I put as much space in between the two of them so that way there's no uncomfortable moments. But let me promise you this, on your wedding day, your parents are going to be on their best behavior. But if your parents do get along, sometimes mom and dad want seats 1 and 2 because they raised you and they want to sit in the best seat possible to see you get married. Next would be parents of the bride. Now, this would exclude the bride's dad because they would hopefully be walking the bride down the aisle if they're still in the picture. So the order for divorced parents would be the bride's stepmom would walk in first, escorted by an usher or family member. If you have to, father of the bride can do this, but then he's pulling double duty, walking two people in, and that means you're leaving the bride by themselves in the bridal suite, nervous on their wedding day, right before they get married, all alone. Next, the bride's mom would walk in and stepdad would follow down the aisle together. So everything else would really remain the same as a traditional processional. So talking about groomsmen and bridesmaids getting down the aisle, they can either go in pairs or they can go in one by one. Then you're looking at the groom, flower girl, ring bearer, and the bride and the father of the bride. Now we can talk about some traditional, non-traditional family processional orders that might happen if some people aren't around. Either they were deceased or they just aren't going to be involved in the wedding that day. So, non traditional family processional order, first and foremost, I'm still sending the officiant down the aisle first. That's just my favorite thing that alerts the photographer to start paying attention and taking photos, that alerts any guests that are turned around talking that the wedding has started and that they need to turn around and pay attention. Of course, next, we're going to send down the grandparents of the groom and then the bride, then parents of the groom, mother of the bride, groomsmen and bridesmaids, either in pairs or one by one. But I can tell you that if the mother of the bride is not present because she's either passed away or she's not going to be around on the wedding day, you can just skip the step. You don't need to hold a place for her. You can go straight from the parents of the groom to the wedding party. Next would be groom and then flower girl, ring bearer, and the bride with the father of the bride. Now, if dad has passed away or isn't involved on the wedding day, you can do a few different things. You can choose a close family member or father figure to walk the bride down the aisle. We've even had weddings that had non symmetrical numbers. So maybe they had 5 bridesmaids and 4 groomsmen, where a brother walked the bride down the aisle. Then he took his place up at the front as like the 5th groomsman. So her wedding pictures were nice and symmetrical. It doesn't always matter if your wedding photos are symmetrical, but to that bride, it did. So it was nice to have a stand in so everything looked even. The other option, if you don't have a father figure or a close male family member to walk the bride down the aisle, I've seen moms walked the bride down the aisle before. And that's a really nice picture and it's a really nice moment for the mother of the bride. And then don't forget, if you don't know who you want to walk down the aisle, you could always walk yourself down the aisle. It's completely fine to make an entrance all alone and have everybody looking just at you. After all, it's your wedding day. For more expert wedding planning advice, follow us at thebridalink.com.